then I guess I am ready and we will begin. We will thank you for engaging in our brief chat here beforehand. We will go ahead and mute you now just for the initial parts here. There are parts where we'll ask you to have some conversation. There I go. We try to keep this a little more interactive than some other webinars that we've been in attendance, and we know that it's tough to sit and have a question and have to sit on it for a full hour and save it for the last 5 minutes or whatever people have to go through. So we will ask you to unmute yourselves a few times throughout to go ahead and share some ideas and conversation throughout. So just be ready for that. But Anissa should have muted you, and if you are not muted, please stay muted. We'll get to those ground rules in just a moment. So we're here talking about formative assessment and what that looks like in this new normal that we find ourselves in for at least the remainder of the school year for the folks that we're talking here now, and perhaps into next year, depending on your state and locality and how the course of everything spreads here. So we have two big strategies we're being mindful of. We want to develop or two big outcomes we want to be mindful of: develop and refine a rationale for implementing formative assessment strategies, as well as identifying some strategies for maximizing those opportunities. We know we don't have a lot of contact time with our kids for a variety of reasons over the next several weeks and months. So how do we make the most of that? And how do we, given all of the extraneous circumstances that are placed upon us here? With that said, we have a few new faces in the room. So we do want to be mindful of some of our ground rules. We did begin on time. We will end on time. You will be here no longer than 4 o'clock. We promise you that. But to help facilitate that, please stay focused and be respectful as we're sharing ideas and as we open up the floor for you to share some of your ideas. The other thing we want to highlight is that please assume positive intent. You are all 23 of you are taking time out of your day that you could otherwise be spending time to do whatever it is that you might be doing. And you chose to take this hour to spend with us to learn a little bit more about formative assessment and to engage in this discussion with your colleagues. So everyone is coming with a good reason for being here, and we always want to be mindful of that, especially if we hear ideas that might conflict with some of the ideas that we bring to the table. Please use the chat feature, as some of you have already doing, for questions and responses, and we'll highlight that more in a second, how we'll use that. And as you already are doing, please mute the microphone when not speaking. That prevents you and us from hearing a little bit of some of the feedback and some of the chaos that could be happening around us. Full disclosure, I will be presenting for most of the time, and I do have a 5-month-old who is very talkative and sometimes gets very angry if she's not fed quickly, or sometimes she gets angry if she's fed too quickly. She just gets angry. That's what they do. So you may hear her crying in the background, but Mom is doing everything she can to keep it under control. I just wanted to let you know that as before we get started here. Few housekeeping things. Please share your questions and ideas in the chat. Normally, like in a face-to-face professional learning, it's frowned upon to talk while the presenter is talking, but here we want you to, because we can see what you're talking about. So those back channel conversations are a powerful learning tool. Please keep the conversation going, on the sidebar, in the chats, especially as ideas come up that you say, yeah, I've used that before. You have more questions about that. That's how we know what is resonating with you. So through that chat, Anissa and I will track and respond to as many questions as we can, either at a logical pausing point throughout the presentation here. We do have a Q&A block reserved at the end, and we will, for those of you who have participated with us previously in the series, we do have a follow-up email that goes out after these, where we try and round up some of those questions that are hanging. Or if it's a more personalized question, you've private messaged us or we will certainly follow up with you to do that. To help facilitate that, we want to be really straightforward and transparent and let you know that we are saving the chat that you are participating in here. That allows us to go back through and comb and see any unanswered questions and make sure we addressed everything that needed to be addressed. And it also allows us to compile some additional resources and ideas that you share. So especially in this space and time that we're spending together. We have a few ideas to bring to the table about formative assessment, but we certainly want to hear about a lot of your experiences and a lot of the apps or different techniques you might be using. So please do put those in the chat so we can get some of the best thinking from you in your locality and share that with some of our colleagues across the country. So that said, we will welcome and officially warm you up here and do a little jog in your memory. NISTA will publish a poll question here for you to respond to. There are 2 questions. One of them asks you about which formative assessment practices you have used in your face-to-face instruction, as well as what you are using now and what you've used before. So please go ahead and respond to both of those. We'll give everyone just a moment to respond. You may select as many responses as you like, and we'll move forward from there. This is an awkward silence, at least it feels awkward, but many of you are voting. I'll give you just a few more minutes to finish up, and then we'll see what survey says here in just a moment. And Anissa, as we're keeping an eye on the polls, what are you seeing any other options being added to the chat? Anissa, I think you were trying to talk, but you were still muted.
Oh, okay. Well,
okay, there we go.
I was gonna say, I'll just blame you, Randy. But
okay.
Somebody shared, Treva shared that she's used manipulative whiteboards online so that they can, she can check for understanding that way. I don't know if she's using it right now, but she has in the past. So, okay. And we have 17 of 24, so we're pretty good. Randy, if we want to wait just another couple of seconds, I'll leave that up to you.
Okay. Well, my philosophy is we've got 2.5 minutes for you to read those questions here. We do have a fairly good sampling of the responses here, so let's go ahead and see what that is. As soon as I end the poll, the results should, or as soon as Anissa ends the poll, the results should be posted on your screen. So we can see a little bit about the strategies that our colleagues are using. Certainly, there's a variety of responses we use within our classrooms. A lot of us use calling our students to respond to ask the questions. We see a lot of formative assessment apps like Socrative and Kahoot, and some other strategies as well, individual whiteboards. As we go down to the second question, there's some clear winners there in Kahoot and Google Forms in terms of things that you have experience with. There's also some poll everywhere in Pear Deck, which we'll highlight some of those as well. And so we won't touch all of these in great detail today because we don't have the time to in an hour. But I am curious about, for the folks that use Plickers, what are some of the ways we're using that? And feel free to unmute yourselves and tell us a little bit more about how you've used that in the past.
Randy, did you say Plickers, P-L?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure.
Okay.
So Randy, A couple of people are saying that they're interested in hearing more about several of these. Some of them we haven't heard of. So we tried to put some on there on the list that were very well known, like Kahoot, and then others that may not be as well known, so that we can talk about that and put another tool in your tool belt, or at least something to consider.
Yes. And so going forward throughout the remainder of our time together today, we will talk about some of these in some detail. Certainly don't have enough time to make you experts in many of them, as the case may be. We will talk some about in some detail on how you might be able to use them. And certainly in the follow-up email we'll send later tomorrow once the recording is processed, because we do send out a recording of the webinar to you. We'll send out a little bit more about some of these as well. So please look out for that. All right, let's move forward. So thank you for sharing with us what you've done in the past and what you are doing now. We want to take a moment to recalibrate and make sure we're all on the same page. As I've seen in chat, that we have some of us from districts in Michigan, some Oregonians, some Ohioans as well, which means for as many educators we have in this room and as many different places you're from, there's a lot of different definitions of formative assessment. So I wanted to make sure we're starting coalesced around the same one. So we borrow, while there are a lot of definitions out there, for this particular setting, we borrow one from Susan Brookhart and her 2010 work that says this: formative assessment refers to the ongoing process students and teachers engage in when they focus on learning goals, take stock of where current work is in relation to the goal, and take action to move closer to the goal. So when you are using apps like Socrative, right, you're checking for content knowledge, you are saying, here's what I need you to know, student. Do you know it? Yes or no? And what do I need to help you get there, right? When you're using some other apps and some other strategies, that process looks much the same. And we'll detail that as we go forward here in a few more of these. What Brookhart also says a little bit about the why formative assessment is important is that the effect of good formative assessment can be the equivalent of moving from the 50th percentile to the 65th or 75th percentile on a standardized assessment. Which means that if we as educators are taking time to regularly check for kids' understanding, provide them feedback to help them move closer to whatever learning goal it is that we have for them, that means good things for their growth. Does not mean they'll all move to the 100th percentile, right? They might not be best in class by the time we're done with them, but by using some of these effective strategies that we're going to discuss here, we definitely have the potential to contribute to their growth. The other thing she points out that's super important for us to think about, especially in this remote context that we think about, is what students realize that information, both teacher feedback and self-assessment, can help them improve. They process material more deeply, they persist longer, and try harder. So in other words, once they realize that what they're doing matters, right, and that they can see some tangible benefit from that, they can see that, you know what, Miss Dillon said, I need to do this when I am speaking in Spanish. I need to check on this pronunciation key, right? I can move forward and do this better even next time, or do this even better next time. So when we're providing them actionable feedback to move forward, it drives their persistence. It drives their desire to continue to do well. Success breeds success. So we'll take a moment to stop and jot in the chat and just think about that definition and some of the rationale that Brookhart presents. What connections do we see between what Brookhart is talking about in what we briefly outlined there and our work during distance learning? What about this rings either true or rings new for you in the context that we find ourselves? Please feel free to drop a few comments in the chat. Anissa, what are some things that folks might be saying?
Well, our folks are very focused on thinking, so give them just a sec and then they're going to start writing in the chat.
Okay, fair enough.
And Randy, do you mind saying the question again and just clarifying for everybody?
Mm-hmm. So Brooke outlines this definition of formative assessment. It says essentially, do we have a goal in mind? Are we checking for student progress toward that goal? And are we giving feedback to move kids there, even closer toward that goal after we check for understanding? So as we think about that process and the rationale outlined in the slides about how it can drive student growth and persistence, what are some connections we see between that work and our work as educators now during distance learning?
And so some of the things then that we're seeing from everybody is, you know, it's difficult, right? Because encountering the attitude that the kids don't think they have to do school, but other people are saying, but the kids that are connecting with that back and forth, that helps. Giving that feedback seems to really be helpful for kids. And in order to give feedback, we have to check. So those absolutely go hand in hand. Also seeing from a couple of people the importance of the self-reflection from the kids. So asking them where they think they are in the learning, or asking them questions like, give me 3 things you've learned in the last couple of lessons about, and then whatever that session is. But I think the general thinking is that it's harder, it's more difficult than it has been for several different reasons. And so I think everybody's really interested in trying to figure out together, how do we make it work? And especially as another tool for helping to engage kids.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that last clause you add is a tool to engage kids, rather. Hopefully we get more than one kid. Tool to engage kids is a key portion here, right? We know that in many cases, for whatever reason, states or districts have said, you know, this work is pass and complete or pass fail. And for some of us, we see there's a real motivation killer for some of our kids. So how do we get that back? And through that personal interaction that Anissa mentioned, that I think one of you mentioned as well. I can't see the chat while I'm presenting here. So whether it's through that personal interaction, whether it's through that feedback where they see some real value and that growth in the work that they're doing here, that's the important part. That's one tool in our toolbox that we can help to engage them. And so those are some of the tools we're going to talk about here as we go forward. So we propose that there are 4 elements to think about as we design formative assessments during this time. 1, we want to make sure we choose the right tools for the job. We know that there are a slew of apps out there that you might use, or a slew of devices and strategies you might use, and even low-tech ways for those students who don't have access to technology that you can still use to get in touch with them. So how do we make sure we're choosing the right things to answer the questions and find the information that we want about our kids? Secondly, we can look at building a portfolio over time, and we'll expand on that, but that can definitely help kids see the value in the work they're doing, where they can chart growth from point A to point Z throughout this closure, and even when they return to school in the fall. We also know that many of you are using synchronous sessions like this Zoom webinar to facilitate some learning for your folks. So we'll talk about some different ways and some different strategies to incorporate formative assessment into that. We know that chat is a way to do that, and pausing and asking and waiting for questions is a way to do that. But there's some other ways and some other apps we can use to embed in that as well. And we also want to talk about the power of personal conversations. We know that many of you are checking in with your students. You have either weekly or semi-regular calls with many of your students, whether they're advocates or you are making that connection as a content area teacher. And we'll use that. We'll talk about how we can use some of those conversations to check for understanding. So first, when we're talking about choosing the right tools, this first real element we want to pay attention to. Don't choose a lot of tools, I think is our first takeaway, and select 2 to 4 apps or strategies for you to think about as formative assessment during this time. One of the reasons we recommend that is for your own sake. While this is a great time to experiment, we know for a variety of reasons, if you have children at home or you are managing or you have relatives on the front lines, you are under stress too, right? So take care of yourself. Don't go out and try to learn every new app that we talk about today. But pick 1, 2, 3, no more than 3 or 4 that makes sense to you and that you think will be high value for you and your students. Secondly, depending on the context which you find yourself in, whether if you're an elementary teacher or a secondary teacher, if for example, I'm in the middle school and I have six different teachers and each of my teachers is picking 4 apps, that means as a kid, I might have 24 new apps to have to learn that all do similar things, but they all work in slightly different ways, right? So we want to make sure that we want to keep our selection narrow, and where we can to coordinate that selection with our colleagues to make sure we're not overwhelming our kids, and perhaps even more importantly, the parents that have to support them with the technology at home. So please keep our selections narrow. That said, there's 2 different jobs broadly that forward assessment falls into. One is we can check for content knowledge, and this is where the poll said we were more familiar with. So apps like Kahoot, Socrative, or Quizlet, right? Those are can be either multiple choice or open-ended response. They do help us check for content knowledge. Do you understand this topic? What do you know about it? Am I asking these questions as we go forward here, and so we can get some information that way. Some apps that we were less familiar with in the poll are apps that we can use to check for students' process and to help them illustrate their thinking. So apps like Flipgrid allow them to record short videos, right? So they can describe, here's what I'm thinking about here at this point in time. They can make that thinking visible about this particular math problem, about how they're attacking writing this particular portion of an essay, and get that back to you and show them what they can show you what they're thinking, so you can then give them some feedback on that, whether that's affirming or adjusting. Animoto is another app where it's less student creation, more video editing, so to speak. So if they are putting together a video story, or something that shows their sequence of understanding, Animoto is more suited for that. And Kialo is another neat app for those of us on the humanities side of things. Essentially what it lets you do is build an argument and build pieces of evidence and drag and drop evidence to support that argument within. So you can see the thought process and how students are connecting these big points to the different evidence that they have found to support that, or the different evidence that you provided to support that. There's a variety of different ways that app could work. But in either case, formative assessment serves those 2 purposes in our classrooms: to check for content knowledge, to check for process, and those are some apps that fit under those umbrellas. We want to pause here for a moment and give you a chance to just start filling up our chat box. What are some other tools that fit into either the content knowledge or thought process categories that perhaps we haven't talked about so far?
And Randy, while people are doing that and thinking and sharing, Dawn had a good question in terms of those that you talked about. Are there any that you would more highly recommend for elementary teachers and students? Like, are there some that are more geared towards secondary versus elementary?
To expand on that question, I think it depends on the purpose. So when we talk a little bit more about later in the session, we'll talk about an app called Pear Deck, and I think that's probably better suited for your elementary folks during synchronous sessions. But I don't want to spoil that so much. When we talk about doing some process checks, that is probably not directly on that list, but apps like Shobi or Seesaw. And we can talk more about this later. I know we do have some other elementary folks as well. But apps like Shobi or Seesaw Seesaw especially is really friendly for the K-3 crowd in terms of a simple user interface for them to access and record some videos and do some annotation that way. So we can talk a little bit more about those later, and please feel free to, I've made a note of that now, so I will follow up with a little bit later with you, Don. So I hope that is a good enough for now answer, but there will certainly be more answers to that. Was there anything else that you've noted in chat so far?
Well, I think one of the things that a lot of us are trying to keep in mind is, if we are using Google Classroom for our kids that have that access, taking advantage of the Google Classroom tools So for instance, the quizzes and things like that that are in there, and the discussion boards are also a great way to do formative assessment that doesn't necessarily have to bring in a third-party tool, an app for the kids.
Right, and that is something to consider as well. The students' cognitive load in trying to manage the apps and responding to things here. Absolutely. So if step one is choosing the right tool for the job, there's one element of formative assessment here. Another one avenue we can think about is asking students to build a portfolio. And that portfolio really allows us to gather evidence of progress toward a specific goal over time. So that might be drafts of an essay. So here's my first draft, and they submit that to you for some feedback. And you give them some feedback. They make their edits, they make their revisions, and so that feedback can be an ongoing dialogue. And that might get shoved in the, or shoved sounds really imprecise. That might get stored in the portfolio so they can see evidence of how they're thinking and how their skills have evolved over time. If they are designing an experiment, depending on the resources you're able to provide to students or the resources that are available to them in their communities, if they're designing an experiment or a Rube Goldberg machine or something of the sort, they can certainly chart their design process. Here's what my design looked like here. Here's what I realized didn't work. And I can go forward and reflect on that a little bit further, whether that's video evidence or otherwise. Certainly if they're solving complex mathematical problems, they can chart their journey throughout that, or steps in a research project. So that first step of portfolio might be, here's my brainstorming. Here's where I narrowed things down and tried to draft my research question. Here's how I tried to sort some evidence. I'm pointing to my desk so you can see me. Here's where I started some more drafting and so on and so forth. There's lots of different steps and avenues you might include in that portfolio. So if that's the concept in a broad way, what does that look like for kids that have consistent internet access? Well, as we talked about earlier, that could be Flipgrid videos, right? It could be, here's where I am in designing my Rube Goldberg machine. Here is step A or step B, and here's my thinking right here at this moment. And we can track how that thinking evolves over time. Certainly in apps, if you have things like Blackboard or Schoology as your learning management system, or apps like Seesaw or Shobi, you can record videos native in those places. For Google folks, you might have your students have a private YouTube channel, or if some of them are already aspiring YouTubers, you might ask them to submit videos there about some of their thinking as well as some of the journaling that we talked about in some previous sessions here, where it gives them a chance to say, here are my thoughts at this point in time, here's how I'm reacting to this, here's what I've learned so far, here's what I'm struggling with, and really chart that thinking and that journey toward that bigger goal over time. For students who may not have consistent access, similar things, we just have to think about a different avenue for them to do that. Journaling works as well in a Google Doc online as it does in a composition notebook, right? So we might have students journal about their experience and about their learning and as they navigate through that project. We might ask them to collect examples of work over time. So if there is a one overarching learning target that we're coming back to, such as using evidence to support your argument, we might have them collect their first essay, right? And with the feedback and that final grade, and collect another essay on a similar topic later in the year, right? And use those to really support that conversation about growth and where they have moved forward. And certainly photo evidence is certainly an option here too, right? They can, if they have the ability to take and have photos developed or printed or otherwise, they can record their photo evidence of that Rube Goldberg machine, of that whatever it is that they're designing and going forward. So certainly there's similar options available to those students, just a slightly different delivery method, which we have to be mindful of. In any case though, when we choose to have students build a portfolio, whether it's students that have consistent internet access or students that are not as readily able to do that, we want to be mindful of three things. First, we want to make sure that we have checkpoints. So for example, after each stage of the writing process, I want you to add another artifact to your portfolio so I can track your thinking in time. If we were to say, students, go build a portfolio and show me your work over time, we don't know what we'll get, right? So providing those checkpoints allows us a way to be a little more precise in saying, here's what should be in your portfolio, here's what the thinking we need to see, here's the evidence of your learning that I'd like you to see as you continue on this learning journey. Second, especially in the journaling prompts and the Flipgrid videos, right, where we have an opportunity for them to make their thinking visible, let's facilitate some of that self-reflection. Let's say, here's the spots that are going well for me, here's what's not going well, here's what I would do differently next time. And especially in video or written format, if they've had a chance to commit to that, we can remind them next time that say, hey, here's a similar problem to what we're doing, and we had this learning experience. Maybe next time, let's use our strongest piece of evidence or more thoroughly vet our evidence, rather than picking up the first thing that we see that is kind of tangentially related here, right? So we can help them facilitate that sort of self-reflection. And certainly, as when we provide feedback on the artifacts that they keep in their portfolios, that gives that portfolio even more value, right? When we are saying, when we can point out some of the patterns of growth for them, that is a great help to see them, and that, again, lets them see the value of that formative assessment and is another hook to get them engaged. So we'll pause here for a moment and ask you to think about some of the learning targets that either you have determined that are essential over the next few weeks, or that your district, or however it is that we're making decisions about what we teach over the next few weeks. What are some targets that or goals that would be suitable for building a portfolio? What are some things your kids are expected to learn over the next few weeks for which a portfolio might be helpful?
And Randy, I think as everybody's thinking and putting in the chat, one thing to remember is, you know, words are very powerful. And I think that for some of us, when we think of portfolio, we think of that really big thing that kids are taking the whole year or the whole 4 years of their high school or whatever that might be to put together. And as we're thinking about portfolios here, especially as those frequent checks for understanding, we're talking about something that could be much smaller. So for instance, that example of the photo evidence of a home lab that the kids are doing, or some other problem-solving aspect that they're doing. It can be something simple as that could only take a week or two, but this is really our great chance, trying to think of silver linings, our great chance of saying, you know what, I've always wanted to have the kids put some work together or do some type of portfolio. So now as I'm thinking about what my focus learning targets are for the next few weeks, how could I maybe do that? How would that work with the kids?
I think that's an important clarification to make, right? Where a portfolio generally has a larger connotation, but certainly in the time frame we have available and the time we have to design and launch work like these, we are talking on a smaller time scale. Okay. What else are we seeing in chat as far as some ideas that folks are proposing, Anissa?
One of the ideas was using that notebook at home to journal daily about what's happening and how they're feeling, so we get that SEL, what's happening in the world, as well as then what's going on in terms of the classroom as well. Mm-hmm. Somebody asked a clarifying question, so is portfolio a formative assessment? And so as we think about it, it can be a combination. The final portfolio, putting it all together, could be your more summative, which right now for us, most of us are taking pass incomplete grades at most. But as we think about the smaller checks in between, those smaller like little due dates or the different steps that go within putting together a portfolio, that's our formative check. And right now, since we don't have the kids in front of us, this is a good way for them to collect evidence and share with us every so many days or what have you, so that we can give them feedback as they continue on putting this together.
Right. So to put a little more meat on that example, if I were just to assign an essay and by the end of this week have your research completed, by the end of next week have your first draft completed, so on and so forth, to have them record and submit, that journey, all the evidence they're supporting, and put that in their portfolio to submit for evaluation. We're providing feedback at each step along the way. That's where we can really see portfolios have value as a formative tool. Certainly the completed portfolio at the end of this particular project would be your more summative assessment. But as Anissa pointed out, it's those right now checks for understanding, those incremental checks that we want to be mindful of when we're thinking about portfolios. as we move forward here and being mindful of your time, we have two more strategies to discuss before we wrap everything up here. And this is a chance for us to go a little bit deeper into some of the apps we talked about earlier. So we know that one tool in all of your tool belts is synchronous sections like these, where you're having either all of your kids or as many kids as you can round up, visit you for a short lecture or discussion or a small check-in conversation. And that is as close to a live classroom setting as we can get now. And we know that in those live classroom settings, that formative assessment is so important. So we know that we can see where kids' understanding is, but also so we can get a sense of, are you with me generally, right? Are you here? Are you checked in? Are you present? So certainly, depending on the platform you and your school have adopted, you have a variety of tools at your disposal. In some platforms, you have a yes or no button that's embedded in the tool. You could ask a quick question. People give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. Here in Zoom, at the beginning of the webinar here today, we had you respond to a poll. That's a feature built into Zoom, so we could certainly use that. We could also use private or public chat to ask questions. So if, as you are chatting in the sidebar at the moment, although that is public, right? But if you were to click on the little drop-down menu and say, I only want to chat to Randy or only want to chat to Anissa and ask us a question that way, that's a way for them to make those questions and responses private. So if a student has a question, they don't feel comfortable asking in front of the group, they can private message that to you. If you'd like that more discreet, hidden answer from them, you can also certainly take advantage of that feature. There's also other tools that can be helpful during synchronous learning. Padlet and Kahoot and Google Forms, you said you were fairly familiar with in the poll, so I won't spend a lot of time with those, but I do want to expand on Pear Deck and Padlet here for just a moment. If I were exactly in your shoes as an educator, and there was one tool I wanted to take some time to invest in, and I knew that because I knew I was going to use my synchronous sessions for a lot of direct instruction, it would probably be Pear Deck. The reason why is it's a little bit like Socrative, but you can embed it directly into your Google Slides presentations. So in other words, you can have this presentation without having to flip over to another screen or another app or anything else. You can pop up questions here, and if students have joined your Pear Deck session, right, similar to how they join a Socrative session or a Kahoot session or anything else at the beginning of the lesson, they can pop in and provide some either multiple choice questions, they can responses rather, they can provide some open-ended questions, and you can get some feedback right there, and it records some of that feedback for you at the end of that lesson. On the individual basis, I know that it is free for you to try with some limited features. If it is something that gathers steam organically, certainly there are options for districts as well. But if there's one tool that I knew I was going to use because I was going to rely on synchronous instruction for a lot of lectures and things like that, that might be one to investigate. Padlet is another great tool for having kids get a lot of thinking out on something at once. It's like a big old whiteboard that everyone gets to write on, and you can attach links, you can attach pictures, you can attach videos, you can attach all kinds of stuff to it, and you can really see a lot of thinking. It's like a big old gallery walk that you can have for your kids and really generate some conversation that way. So if I have had a discussion or if I'm wanting students to present some of their final research from a paper, right, I can have them link their papers on this Padlet and have them go and drop in on some of their peers and provide some feedback and some thinking as well. So that's another use for that. Kahoot and Google Forms, you seem pretty well versed in. They're both really well suited for some selected response stimuli. Google Forms does have some open-ended capabilities as well, as those of you who are versed in it know. So I won't take too much time with those, but I did want to take time to really highlight Pear Deck and Padlet as two things that I might encourage you to investigate.
And Randy, the other day I was talking with a teacher who was using Padlet not only in the synchronous, she got them started that way, but then they were able to continue adding to the Padlet in the asynchronous aspect after the lesson. And that way then, she was asking them questions at the end to look up something, to look up a real life example, then they were able to put that link right into the Padlet. So that was a pretty interesting idea.
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
And does Padlet work in Google Hangout, for Google Meet? I mean, I think how does that was a question that somebody had,
okay.
Randy.
Okay. So let me go back to where we're all focused on the same thing here. So things like Padlet and Kahoot and Google Forms, one of the unfortunate things is that you'd probably have to be running it side by side. So you as the teacher would have to have a Padlet window up. You could screencast it, right? And share your screen so you could see some evidence of that. And students would have to log in separately and make their responses to that. So they'd have to go side by side or whatever it is. And that could be a possible technical barrier. So just to point that out, that they don't natively work together, you have to have a sort of a workaround and work them side by side. The only one that directly integrates with the Google Suite, if you're a Google school, although they does integrate with Microsoft software as well, is Pear Deck. So I want to pause there and say, are there any more questions about any of those tools before we move forward?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
But somebody else was talking about, as a temperature check for kids, to use emoticons. They used to use thumbs up, thumbs down in the classroom, like a lot of us do, to do that quick temperature check. And so now using emoticons is another great way of just taking advantage of the technology as a good temperature check for where the kids are in their understanding.
Okay, thank you. That's another great idea. Use the tools that we have in front of us and make it engaging for the kids. The last tool we have available to us is leveraging personal conversations. So we know that many of you have scheduled check-in calls, or you're being asked to or expected to check in with your students regularly. So you might have these scheduled calls or video conferences, or you could even use recordings to leverage some of this form of assessment. So these could be pre-scheduled things, like I know I'm going to talk with student X, Y, and Z at 9, 9:15, and 9:30, and set appointments that way. You might also have drop-in office hours where you're available from 9 through 12, and kids can drop in video chat with you or give you a phone call, whatever the case might be, and have this conference with you. We can also take one of the blessings here is we can take advantage of some asynchronous options as well, right? If Flipgrid allows you, as well as Marco Polo, allow you to record short video clips, and if that video clip says, here's what I'm thinking about right now, or here's where I'm struggling, you as the teacher can then respond to that and say, thank you for sharing. Here's an additional thing to think about, or here's another question I have for you that might point you in the right direction. Or have you tried looking at resource A, B, or C to help you out? So you don't have to be face-to-face to still have that, you don't have to be there at the same time, rather still have that face-to-face contact and connection. And I think perhaps for many of our kids, that's really valuable, where we have the opportunity they can interact with you, even though it's not in a live conversation as we are, where they can see you, they can hear you. That's so important to maintaining that connectivity with you. These conversations, though, don't, while they can be social check-ins, there is a goal there. We're talking about formative assessment here, right? So we want to make sure that when we're entering those formative assessment conversations, that we have some prompts to assess those understanding of key concepts. So we'll start with an overarching question, right? Tell me a little bit more about what went well for you with this draft. What are you struggling with, right? And we know that some of our kids will either give us paragraph long responses, and some of the kids will go, I'm doing okay, right? So as a teacher, what are some of the coaching moves, or what are some of the ways that we might prompt more conversation? How do we follow up with them and provide some cues, or provide some cues to further that conversation going on? It's important to have some of those questions in your back pocket, especially as you engage in multiple of these conversations a day, because it's fatiguing. I make no bones about it that having a lot of conversations, as I'm sure you know, we love those kids, but just the act of getting on the phone and talking with them for 10, 15 minutes at a time and going through that roster can be fatiguing. So having those touchstone points in the conversation and really planning that out as far as what content I need you to know and what questions I'm going to ask, as how I'm going to follow up and get more answers out of you, is really helpful to make sure those conversations are as valuable as they can be. So while many of us are using those check-ins for that SEL connection to say, hey, literally, how are you doing? Do you need anything? Are you comfortable right now? Please also remember that we can use the performative assessment. So we can talk about these goals. I want to be better at choosing the most effective evidence to support my claim. And that's a goal we can work towards. So we can certainly have conversations around that. So we have these 4 tools that we've talked about here. Choosing the right tool, or 4 elements rather, we've talked about here. Choosing the right tool for the job, building portfolios over time, checking for understanding in synchronous sessions, and leveraging personal conversations. As you think about those 4 practices, which of them seems most essential to planning, conducting effective formative assessment in your current situation? So for you and how you've currently designed instruction and what you know about your kids, which of those 4 seems like it would be the most effective for you in this moment, in this space? Please feel free to drop some answers in the chat.
And Randy, while we're letting people have their think time and put some things in the chat, something that came up in the back channel conversation was the need for some of us, because we've got some low-tech kids, trying to parallel our online and our non-online lessons. And so the idea of Pear Deck, since it's essentially like a PowerPoint, if you will, that has built-in questions, that's something that we can share with our low-tech kids, are the slides as well as the questions that we would embed. And for Padlet, something that I've seen in the past is, this was actually before remote learning, but actually taking a screenshot of the Padlet once the kids have put in their initial responses, and then sending that to everybody and having the kids then think about and make connections between things that people said, almost using it as then the start of a like a concept map. So there's different things that you could do. All of those, you know, we can talk about different ways that you can print those and use them. But I think that's such a good thing for us to keep in mind is, if I'm going to do this with my online kids and I have to do something very similar for my my offline kids, what does that look like? And how can I maybe use both so that I'm not inventing 2 complete lessons? So it was a great question and something to keep in mind.
And certainly that's something that we need to attend to as we continue throughout this experience that we find ourselves in. The other powerful thing that, as we get a few more examples dropped in chat, the other powerful thing that this situation provides us is some opportunities to examine those practices and how we use them right now, right? If you are someone that's used that Padlet, or that you've used Kahoot or Soccer in your classroom in face-to-face instruction, certainly there's some lessons to be learned about how we apply that knowledge to this remote learning as well, in terms of how we get students involved and how we really manage some of those conversations, discussions that we have. So there's a lot of learning to be done here on both students' parts and ours about how we make all this stuff work, and hopefully transfer some of this to whatever new normal looks like in the fall. Anissa, what are you seeing that some of our folks saying that stands out to them as the most effective practice that we've talked about today?
Definitely reaching out to kids, because that works no matter what technology that they have. Several people are saying that the synchronous sessions are really working well for them. Once they got the technology set up, then that seems to be really good, and they're trying to get more and more kids as the weeks go on. Mm-hmm. Several people have talked about that they want to check out some of the tools that you've discussed, especially Pear Deck seems to be one that people are wanting to look at. And then, of course, becoming more and more proficient at Google Classroom, because I think it seems very universal. I mean, Google Classroom is, they obviously don't have a limit because there's a ton of people on it now. But, you know, it's like we're all learning this. And so if you've got somebody at your building that you can reach out to via email and set up a Google Meet, and they can share their screen and walk you through some Google Classroom stuff. Take advantage of it. There's also some online tutorials if that's, you know, more your style. But yeah, just know you're not alone. And we're just working on it day by day to get better and better at using these tools, both us and the kids.
Yes. I also know that Google Classroom in itself, just organizing Google Classroom can be a struggle. But if you so you're at varying parts or varying steps along this journey of mastering Google Classroom and using that right. There are some extensions out there that can help facilitate that. I won't take the time to list them here within this space, but I'll drop a few in our follow-up email that you can investigate to help manage some of that workflow of how do I create 30 copies of this assignment, or how do I facilitate some grading on things. We'll drop some ideas in there, and that's going to depend a lot on your district and what rights they give you to add extensions or so on and so forth as a teacher. But certainly there's options out there to help to make things a little bit easier in Google Classroom, and we're happy to share some ideas around that as well. That said, we do want to open it up a little bit for you to unmute yourselves if you have any pressing Q&A that you would like to ask of either Anissa and I before we go ahead and wrap up our session.
And remember, any of you guys can unmute yourself if you need to, or you can just add it into the chat. And by the way, Randy is the king of wait time, including on webinars.
I'll assume then I just did everything really well and there's absolutely no questions, and we'll follow it up with some of the follow-up email. But please, as you get the follow-up email from us, I know this is there are some things that were some high interest to you as far as different apps go, and I'm happy to talk more about them. Please feel free to reach out to us and ask some of those questions. We're happy to sit down with you and have some conversations about what makes most sense for you and your kids. So as we get ready to leave today and go our separate ways for this brief session, please check your emails. There is now, or there will be shortly, a feedback survey waiting for you. That survey lets us know how we did today, and also lets you give some input on what future sessions might look like throughout the remainder of the academic year. For those of you that need to track PL hours and you need some piece of paper that says, I participated in PL for X amount of hours, that survey is how we're tracking attendance. So yes, we might have seen your face here and chatted that and chatted with you a little bit, but the best evidence we have of who was here and who made it through the end is those survey responses. So as long as you respond, we'll do some work in the back end on June and get you a certificate and say, yep, you've been with us for X amount of hours. So you can do with that whatever you need to as far as providing that to your building or to your state or whatever needs to happen. One thing on that survey is an exit ticket response. And the exit ticket question is detailed down below. What will formative assessment look like for you in the coming weeks? So what strategies will you use? How will you get to know what kids know over the coming weeks? So please drop some thinking in there in the survey. We're happy to hear about that and share some thinking and see what you're excited about. And with that, we are quickly approaching 4 o'clock. Anissa and I will stick around for any last minute questions, but we do thank you for your time and attention today. The chat has been robust, as Anissa has shared with us. And we look forward to seeing you, many of you, on Friday for our next piece of our independent reading. And that's that. It's been a little slice of heaven. Thanks for spending the afternoon with us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. And remember, check the email that you registered with, and that's where you'll find the link to the survey.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Me too.
Thank you.